This panel is going to look at moral visions for after neoliberalism.
One of neoliberalism's sort of most powerful elements is the way it cloaked the role of the state. So it made the state seem invisible. It made it seem that it was a market that had superseded the state when, of course, neoliberalism fundamentally relied on the state in a variety of ways in its regulatory and legal capacities. And in many respects, was a way in which the state worked through the market. So I think that's also was one of its strengths, precisely because it could build on the sort of idea that the state was a sort of grabbing hand, the state was corrupt, and so forth, while offering an alternative. The third, I think, a sort of strength of neoliberalism was the way in which it coupled ideas of economic freedom with political liberty. I think that was also crucial. Yet despite these three strengths, we're here at a conference which has been titled Beyond Neoliberalism. So clearly there are weaknesses in the armor of neoliberalism. I mean, some of that could just be in the outcomes. This is, of course, has been especially clear in the developing world since, at least the late 1970s, with the sort of particularly with the growing role of the bank and the fund and the Washington Consensus, coming out of the 70s crises. And it's obviously become apparent in the global north as well, maybe especially since the 2007-2008 financial crisis.
I'm an ethnographer by trade, and specifically I conducted the bulk of my fieldwork in Mansfield, a former mining and manufacturing town in the Midlands, a little ways north of here in this country. And the thing that I kept hearing almost as soon as I moved to Mansfield was, they're all corrupt. There was a wide array of different idioms for this locally. So they're greasing their palms, they're feathering their own nest, they're taking backhanders, they're on the take, lining their pockets. And this was not an accusation of corruption strictly in sort of the World Bank definition or the Transparency International definition, but it conveyed this sense of decay of the civic realm, the sense that politicians are not in it for us, that they are self-serving. A snippet of common sense that we can very much draw on is the fact that people had very little respect for the price mechanism, especially when it came to essentials. This came up a lot in relation to supermarket prices, which are a constant topic of conversation. When I'm in Mansfield now, this is what people will talk to me about almost every time we speak. And they will say that in the local Morrisons, as soon as the discount items are put on the shelves, one woman told me, it's like the zombie apocalypse, because people are flooding in, and this is obviously because of cost of living pressures. And it's unacceptable to me, and also to the people I speak to. The same is true for rents and housing costs, water, other utilities. There's absolutely a willingness to say that that is wrong. There's no respect or no sense that, well, this is just the price that the market has set for it. This belief that people deserve to live, that we deserve to have access to the essentials. It's not going to be easy. Clearly, it's going to be very hard to espouse a moral vision if most of our spokespeople for it, especially those who are elected representatives, are mistrusted and seen to be self-enriching, corrupt figures. But there's also lots of good that we can and should draw on as we sort of rebuild solidarities and construct a new political project.
And I mainly want to return or start by going back to Noam's opening speech yesterday, which pretty much, I think, established a synonymity between two things, which I think is very helpful and which has been visible in every panel ever since, namely that post-neoliberalism means restoring capital discipline. This is basically what it means, and the question we're trying to figure out is how do we do that? And I think through the discussions, there have been three dimensions to this task. The first is ideational, so how do you change the policy atmosphere or the policy space in which ideas circulate? I think a lot has changed there, and certainly some paradigms have been tumbling over. I think there's an institutional state-level story to this, which is about institutional capacity. Is there the personnel to actually enact these ideas? But something we've heard less about, and which Noam did talk about as well, is what is the society-level precondition for the restoration of capital discipline and therefore for post-neoliberalism. And Noam made mention to a term, namely developmental coalitions, which I think is also a reference to Mark Blythe's notion of a growth coalition. I think developmental coalition is even more ambitious than just a growth coalition. But we saw it in a presentation this morning, for example, on the PT, so on the Brazilian Workers' Party, is that the institutional precondition, namely to be able to build these multinationally competitive firms, comes with a coalition, namely the PT, so the Lulismo coalition. And actually, to talk about capital discipline without this coalition either requires a really strong authoritarian civil service. I think that's what Vivek Shibber says in his work on developmentalism, or you'd actually need, not necessarily democratic, because I think, for example, the CCP is also a developmental coalition, but it's not democratic. But without this precondition, it's immensely hard to restore capital discipline. And the aim of my story, therefore, is to talk about the political constraints on post-neoliberalism. What makes it so hard for us to get there? And, I mean, analogously, that is also a story about the political effects of neoliberalism. Not just what has neoliberalism done to inequality, to economics, to international trade, to philosophy, but what has it done to our political culture, and how is the political culture we inhabit still constraining for the type of move past neoliberalism that we're trying to affect?
Well, it's very clear from looking at that and many other pieces from that era is that we all thought about this in moral terms, right? And we connected our desire to find a post-neoliberal politics, a new paradigm, we connected it very clearly back to other social movements. Not just 2011's Occupy. It is very important, by the way, that we are the 99% is a moral claim. But we connected our work back to 1999 and the battle in Seattle and the fight against globalization. And certainly the movements in the United States and globally, but that came directly after, as we were really meeting, 2019 and 2020 saw the Green New Deal and the movement for Black Lives. These were all movements that were full of moral claims. So then what happened, right? Because those moral arguments were really lost as these ideas were translated into policy during the Biden years. And I would argue that this lost in translation problem has had enormous political implications. I believe that the lack of a publicly available moral core to any of that very difficult and hard and I would argue largely successful policy work that a number of people did, certainly a number of people in this room did, but that loss of a moral core was really the reason, a core reason anyway, that we never built a mass politics around these signature legislative and policy achievements.